They were seconds away from signing the largest oil acquisition in corporate history, a $50 billion deal that would reshape global energy markets when a quiet voice from the maintenance corridor made the entire boardroom freeze. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't a board member. He was just the night janitor. And yet, 4 words from his mouth made an oil heiress question everything she thought. She knew about her family's empire. What could a single father who mopped floors possibly understand about billion-dollar energy deals that a room full of Harvard MBAs had missed? Stay with this story, because sometimes the person cleaning up after everyone else sees the mess that matters most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. On the 57th floor of Titanium Tower in downtown Houston, the most powerful boardroom in the American energy sector hummed with anticipation. The morning sun cast long shadows through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a sprawling metropolis built on oil, ambition, and the kind of wealth that moved mountains and changed nations. Today, those windows would witness history in the making. Aria Lencourt stood at the head of the obsidian conference table, her presence commanding every inch of the room. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in Apex Energy Corporation's 90-year history, inheriting both the crown and the burden of America's third-largest oil empire. Her tailored navy blazer and platinum jewelry spoke of old money, but her sharp green eyes burned with the hunger of someone who had fought for every ounce of respect in a world that still questioned whether a woman belonged in the oil business. Acquisition documents spread before her represented the culmination of 18 months of negotiations. Meridian Offshore Holdings, with its vast network of deepwater drilling platforms across the Gulf of Mexico, would finally belong to Apex, $50 billion. The largest energy acquisition in a decade. The kind of deal that would cement her legacy and silence every whisper about whether she was truly worthy of her family name. The final environmental impact assessments came in this morning, announced her chief financial officer, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he slid a tablet across the polished surface. Everything checks out. The regulatory approvals are confirmed. We're ready to proceed. Around the table, 12 board members nodded in unanimous agreement. These were men who had built empires on calculated risks, who understood that, in the energy business, hesitation meant watching competitors seize opportunities worth billions. The press waited downstairs. Investors had already begun celebrating. Stock prices had surged in anticipation, but it was Victor Heiress who commanded attention as he rose from his seat beside Aria. Tall, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of understated confidence that came from 3 decades in high-stakes corporate law. Victor had been more than Aria's legal counsel. He had been her mentor, her most trusted advisor, and for the past 6 months, something more. Their engagement had been announced quietly, professionally, but everyone in the room understood the implications. This wasn't just a merger of companies. It was the union of 2 of the most influential families in Texas energy. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor's voice carried the smooth authority of a man who had negotiated deals worth hundreds of billions. We stand on the threshold of creating the most dominant energy corporation in the Western Hemisphere. This acquisition will give Apex control of 47% of Gulf deepwater production capacity. He gestured toward the holographic display that materialized above the table, showing a 3-dimensional map of drilling platforms, pipelines, and refineries. That would soon all fall under the Apex umbrella. The technology was cutting edge, the data stunning in its scope. The synergies are unprecedented, Victor continued, his presentation polished and compelling. Meridian's offshore expertise combined with our inland production and refining capabilities will create efficiencies that will drive profit margins beyond anything our competitors can match. Aria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with moments of triumph. This was what she had been born for, trained for, what she had sacrificed everything to achieve. The skeptics who whispered that she was just riding out her grandfather's legacy would finally be silenced. The acquisition would prove that Arya Lencourt was not merely inheriting power, but expanding it. She reached for the fountain pen that had signed every major Apex contract for 3 generations. Her grandfather had used it to secure the company's first major oil leases in East Texas. Her father had used it to negotiate the partnerships that made Apex a global player. Now it would write the next chapter of the family empire. The room fell silent as she positioned the pen above the signature line. Cameras clicked softly as corporate photographers captured what would become a historic moment. The weight of $50 billion, of thousands of jobs, of America's energy future, seemed to settle on the tip of that pen. And then, from the maintenance corridor that ran along the eastern wall of the boardroom, a voice cut through the silence like a blade. Through silk. "Don't sign that contract, ma'am." Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The very air in the room seemed to crystallize around those 5 words, spoken not by a board member or legal advisor or industry expert, but by a man in a dark blue maintenance uniform who stood beside a custodial cart in the doorway. Arya's pen froze an inch above the paper. She had never seen the man before, though something in his steady brown eyes suggested a depth of experience that seemed at odds with the mop in his hands. He was perhaps 40, with graying temples and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in harsh conditions. His name tag read simply Damien R. "Excuse me." Arya's voice carried the icy precision that had intimidated senators and made oil executives twice her age step back in deference. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a single step into the boardroom, his posture straightening in a way that transformed him from invisible maintenance worker to someone who commanded attention through sheer presence alone. "I said don't sign that contract," he repeated, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of urgency that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Not until you understand what you're really acquiring." Victor rose from his chair, his expression shifting from surprise to barely contained anger. "Security," he called toward the hallway, then turned back to the janitor with the kind of smile reserved for those he considered beneath notice. "I'm sure this gentleman meant no harm, but perhaps he's lost his way." But Arya held up a hand, her green eyes never leaving the maintenance worker's face. Something in his expression, something beyond the uniform and the cart, and the complete improbability of the situation, made her hesitate. In 34 years of life in the energy business, she had learned to read people the way geologists read rock formations, and this man was not what he appeared to be. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice carrying both authority and genuine curiosity. Man straightened further, and for a moment, the maintenance uniform seemed like a costume rather than a profession. "My name is Damien Roulaine," he said, his words carrying the careful precision of someone who had once spoken in very different circumstances. "Former senior petroleum engineer with Gulf Coast Environmental Solutions. And if you signed that contract, today you'll be acquiring the largest environmental disaster in Gulf of Mexico history." The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of $50 billion seemed to hang in the air like a storm about to break. The Apex Energy Corporation complex stretched across 47 acres of prime Houston real estate, a monument to American industrial power that could be seen from space. Titanium Tower, its crown jewel, pierced the Texas sky like a silver needle, its reflective surface designed to catch and hold the light of both sunrise and sunset, a symbol of the company's dominance over the energy cycle that powered half the continent. Inside the building's climate-controlled perfection, everything spoke of precision and wealth accumulated over nearly a century. The lobby floor was inlaid with a massive compass rose made from rare minerals sourced from every continent, where Apex maintained operations. The walls displayed photographs of oil derricks and refineries, tanker ships and pipelines, A visual history of humanity's relationship with the black gold that had built fortunes and toppled governments, but it was the 57th floor that truly represented power. Here, in the executive suites, decisions were made that affected oil prices in London, gas stations in Montana, and the heating bills of families from Maine to California. The boardroom where Arya now sat was more than a meeting space. It was the nerve center of an empire that employed over 200,000 people across 6 continents. Arya herself was both product and architect of this world. Born into the Lencourt dynasty, she had spent her earliest years playing in offices where billion-dollar deals were discussed over lunch. Her grandfather, Armand Lencourt, had been a roughneck who parlayed a single oil lease into a petroleum empire. Her father, Philippe, had transformed that empire into a global corporation that rivaled ExxonMobil and Shell in scope and influence. But Arya had inherited more than stock certificates and board positions. She had inherited the burden of proving herself in an industry that still viewed her as an interloper, a pretty face attached to a famous name rather than a legitimate leader. Every decision was scrutinized, every success attributed to her advisors, every setback blamed on her youth or gender or supposed inexperience. The Meridian acquisition was meant to end those whispers forever. $50 billion didn't lie. Success on that scale couldn't be dismissed or attributed to luck. It would establish Apex as the undisputed leader in offshore drilling, controlling nearly half of America's deepwater oil production and positioning the company to dominate the global energy market for decades to come. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victor Heiress understood this better than anyone. As senior partner at Heiress, Morrison & Associates, he had orchestrated some of the largest corporate acquisitions in energy sector history. His legal mind was legendary for its precision. His negotiation skills responsible for deals worth over $300 billion during his career. But more than that, he understood Arya's position, her challenges, her need to establish herself as more than just another trust fund heiress playing at the business. Their relationship had evolved naturally from professional collaboration to personal intimacy. Victor was 20 years her senior, but age had only refined his appeal. He offered stability, wisdom, and perhaps most importantly, unquestioned support for her ambitions. When he proposed 6 months earlier, it had felt like the perfect alignment of personal happiness and professional advancement. The other board members represented the old guard of Texas Energy, men who had known Arya since she was a teenager attending company Christmas parties. They respected her intelligence and admired her determination, but they also remembered when she wore braces and struggled through presentations to her father's executive committee. Their support was genuine but tinged with the kind of paternal protectiveness that sometimes felt more limiting than liberating. The Meridian deal itself was the culmination of 18 months of exhaustive due diligence. Meridian Offshore Holdings controlled 17 deepwater drilling platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, each capable of extracting millions of barrels of oil from reserves thousands of feet beneath the ocean floor. Their technology was cutting edge, their safety record exemplary, their production capacity exactly what Apex needed to maintain its competitive edge against international competitors. The environmental assessments had been thorough. Teams of scientists and engineers had spent months analyzing every aspect of Meridian's operations, from water quality impacts to marine life protection protocols. The regulatory approvals had required navigation through a maze of federal agencies, state authorities, and international oversight bodies. Every box had been checked, every question answered, every concern addressed. Or so everyone believed. The $50 billion price tag represented fair market value plus a premium that reflected Meridian's strategic importance. The financing was already arranged through a consortium of international banks. The integration plans had been drafted by consulting firms that specialized in major corporate mergers. The announcement would trigger a coordinated media campaign designed to showcase Apex's expanded capabilities and dominant market position. But now, in the space of 30 seconds, a maintenance worker had called all of that into question. Damien Roulaine stood in the doorway like an anachronism, a figure from a different world who had somehow wandered into the highest echelons of corporate power. His uniform was clean but worn, his hands calloused from years of physical labor, his presence utterly at odds with the marble floors and hand-tailored suits that surrounded him, yet something in his bearing suggested he had not always cleaned buildings for a living. The way he held himself, the precision of his speech, the complete lack of deference in the face of overwhelming authority, all pointed to a man who had once operated in very different circumstances. The accusation he had just made was impossible to ignore, even if its source seemed laughable. Environmental disaster, the largest in Gulf of Mexico history. Words that could destroy not just the Meridian acquisition, but Apex's entire reputation. Its stock price, its future. Around the table, 12 of the most powerful people in American energy sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing the intervention of a whistleblower or the delusions of a deranged maintenance worker. The signed contracts that would have made history lay untouched, the fountain pen still hovering in Aria's grip like a sword that had been raised but not yet brought down. In the space between heartbeats, between breaths, between the moment when everything seemed certain and the moment when everything became questionable, the future of a $50 billion empire hung in the balance. And at the center of it all, a man with a mop was about to change everything. The silence in the boardroom stretched like a wire under tension, threatening to snap at any moment. Aria's grip on the fountain pen tightened as she studied the man who had just accused her of preparing to sign away $50 billion for an environmental catastrophe. Around the polished obsidian table, 12 board members sat frozen in various states of shock, confusion, and growing anger. Victor was the first to recover, his legal training kicking in with the swift efficiency that had made him legendary in corporate circles. He stood slowly, his silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and fixed Damien with the kind of stare that had intimidated opposing counsel in billion-dollar lawsuits. "Mr. Roulaine, is it?" Victor's voice carried the cool precision of a scalpel. "I'm going to assume you've had some sort of breakdown, perhaps brought on by workplace stress or personal issues. These things happen. But what you've just done is interrupt a legally binding contract, signing with unsubstantiated allegations that could be construed as defamatory." He moved around the table with the predatory grace of a shark sensing weakness, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the thick Persian carpet. "The responsible thing would be for you to collect your cleaning supplies and return to whatever maintenance closet you emerged from, before this situation becomes something that requires legal intervention." But Damien didn't move. Instead, he took another step into the boardroom, his brown eyes never leaving Aria's face. "Ma'am, with respect, I'm not having a breakdown. I'm trying to prevent one. Meridian Platform Delta 7 has been leaking crude oil into the Gulf for 8 months. The leak started small, maybe 50 barrels a day, but it's expanded. Current loss rate is approximately 400 barrels every 24 hours. A ripple of murmurs ran around the table. Charles Whitmore, Apex's chief environmental officer, leaned forward with a frown. "That's impossible. We've reviewed all of Meridian's environmental compliance reports. There's no mention of any leaks, major or minor." Damien turned his attention to Whitmore, and something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that suggested familiarity with technical discussions. That went far beyond maintenance protocols. "Those reports are being falsified. The leak is in a wellhead connection, approximately 200 feet below the platform's main drilling assembly. It's not visible from surface inspection, And it's not showing up in standard pressure readings. Because they've rerouted the monitoring systems. Preposterous, snorted Harrison Blake, a board member whose family had been in the oil business since before Texas was a state. This man is obviously unstable. Security should have removed him. Already. But Arya held up a hand, her green eyes still locked on Damien's face. She had built her career on reading people, on recognizing when someone was lying, or telling the truth, or operating from incomplete information. And despite the complete improbability of the situation, every instinct she possessed was screaming that this man knew exactly what he was talking about. "You said you were a petroleum engineer," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "With Gulf Coast Environmental Solutions." "Yes, ma'am." "Senior project engineer for 7 years. I specialized in offshore drilling systems and environmental impact assessment. I know what a wellhead leak looks like, sounds like, and what kind of damage it can do if it's allowed to continue." Victor stepped closer to Damien, his expression shifting from annoyance to something approaching hostility. "Mr. Roulaine, even if we were to entertain your fantasy for a moment, how exactly would a maintenance worker have access to information about offshore drilling platforms? Do you claim to have swimming abilities that allow you to inspect underwater wellheads during your lunch breaks?" For the first time, something flickered across Damien's features. Not anger, but something deeper. Pain, perhaps, or the kind of weariness that came from battles fought and lost in arenas where principle collided with profit. "I don't have access to the platforms themselves," he said quietly. "But I do have access to the executive floors of this building every night for the past 3 months. I empty trash cans, clean conference rooms, vacuum carpets. And people in expensive suits tend to forget that maintenance workers have eyes and ears." He reached into the pocket of his uniform and withdrew a small digital camera, the kind used for documenting maintenance issues. 3 weeks ago, I found a crumpled document in Mr. Hillcrest's private office wastebasket. Internal Meridian Environmental Report, dated 6 weeks before that. It detailed a minor seepage issue at Platform Delta 7 that was being monitored and contained. Victor's face went white, then flushed red with what could have been anger or embarrassment or something else. "Entirely. You photographed confidential documents? That's theft. That's corporate espionage. That's evidence," Damien interrupted, his voice remaining calm despite the mounting tension in the room. "Evidence that Meridian has been covering up an environmental disaster that's getting worse every day. Evidence that this $50 billion acquisition is really a $50 billion cleanup bill disguised as a growth opportunity." He clicked through several images on the cameras. Small screen, then looked directly at Arya. "The document I found estimated that a full environmental remediation would cost approximately $67 billion if the leak continued at current rates for more than a year. It also noted that Meridian's insurance policies specifically exclude coverage for pre-existing unreported environmental damages." The room erupted in chaos. Board members began talking over each other, voices rising in confusion and concern. Someone mentioned calling the Securities and Exchange Commission. Another suggested contacting Meridian's CEO immediately. Charles Whitmore was already pulling out his phone to contact the company's environmental law team, but Arya heard none of it. She was staring at Damien Roulaine, this impossibly unlikely figure who had wandered out of the building's shadows to potentially save her from the greatest mistake of her life, or destroy her with baseless accusations that could derail the most important deal in Apex's history. "Show me," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The room fell silent. "Show me what you found." Damien held out the camera, his movements careful and deliberate. As Arya took the device, their fingers brushed for just a moment, and she felt the calluses that spoke of hard physical labor mixed with something else. Scars, perhaps, from work in environments where mistakes could be lethal. The camera's screen displayed a photograph of a document that looked genuine. Meridian Offshore Holdings letterhead, technical language that seemed consistent with environmental reporting protocols, and most damning of all, handwritten notes in the margins that appeared to discuss concealment strategies rather than containment solutions. This could be fabricated, Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction. His legal mind was already calculating the implications, the potential liabilities, the nightmare scenario of acquiring a company whose primary asset was an environmental catastrophe waiting to explode into headlines and lawsuits. It could be, Damien agreed, but it's not. And in approximately 72 hours, when the current weather system moves through the Gulf, the increased wave action is going to put enough stress on that wellhead to turn a 400 barrel per day leak into something that makes the Exxon Valdez look like a minor inconvenience. Arya looked up from the camera screen, her mind racing through implications that stretched far beyond financial considerations. Environmental disasters destroyed more than balance sheets. They destroyed lives, ecosystems, entire regional economies. They destroyed reputations and legacies, and everything that generations of her family had built. Why? She asked, the question hanging in the air like incense. Why are you telling me this? Damien's expression softened slightly, revealing something human beneath the determined exterior. Because somebody should know the truth before they make a decision that can't be undone. And because I've seen what happens when good people convince themselves that ignoring a problem will make it go away. The fountain pen fell from Arya's fingers, clattering onto the obsidian table surface with a sound like breaking glass. Around the room, $50 billion in contracts lay unsigned, their pages suddenly seeming less like opportunity and more like evidence in a case that hadn't yet been filed. In the space of 10 minutes, everything had changed. The question now was whether Damien Roulean was a guardian angel or a saboteur, whether his evidence was salvation or destruction, whether the biggest decision of Arya's life would be signing the contract or walking away from it entirely. Outside the tower's windows, the Houston skyline continued its eternal dance with the sun, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in the rarefied air of the 57th floor. But inside the boardroom, time seemed to have stopped, balanced on the edge of a truth that could reshape not just Apex Energy Corporation, but the entire American energy sector. And at the center of it all, a man with a mop had just declared war on a $50 billion lie. Before Damien Roulean ever stood in a billionaire's boardroom, with cleaning supplies in one hand and explosive truth in the other, he had walked a very different path. 7 years earlier, he had been the kind of petroleum engineer that oil companies fought to recruit. The rare combination of technical brilliance and environmental conscience that could navigate the complex challenges of deep water drilling while maintaining the highest safety standards. His office at Gulf Coast Environmental Solutions had overlooked the port of Houston, where massive tankers carried the fruits of his expertise to markets around the world. The walls were covered with certifications, awards, and photographs from drilling platforms where his innovations had increased efficiency while reducing environmental impact. Dr. Damien Roulean, Ph.D. in petroleum engineering from Texas A&M, licensed professional engineer, and one of the youngest experts ever certified for deep water drilling systems analysis. But expertise, Damien learned, was only valuable as long as it aligned with corporate priorities. The project that destroyed his career had started like any other. Triton Energy Corporation, one of the major independents operating in the Gulf, had contracted Gulf Coast Environmental to assess the long-term viability of their aging offshore platforms. It was routine work, the kind of technical analysis that Damien had performed dozens of times. Inspect the infrastructure, evaluate the environmental systems, provide recommendations for continued operation or decommissioning. Platform Echo 12 had been operating for 23 years, pumping oil from reserves deep beneath the Gulf of Mexico. On paper, it was a success story, a testament to American engineering and the kind of technological prowess that made deep-water drilling possible. But when Damien descended in the dive bell to inspect the underwater components, he found something that made his blood run cold. The wellhead casing was cracked. Not obviously, not in a way that would show up in routine pressure tests or surface inspections. But there, 200 feet below the surface, metal fatigue had created hairline fractures that were allowing crude oil to seep into the surrounding water. Maybe 50 barrels a day, dispersed over a wide enough area that it wasn't creating visible surface slicks, but accumulating in the deep water ecosystem in ways that would take years to fully understand. The responsible course was clear. Platform Echo 12 needed to be shut down immediately for comprehensive repairs. The wellhead casing needed to be replaced, the environmental impact assessed, and remediation efforts begun to address the contamination that had already occurred. It would cost Triton approximately $200 million and 6 months of lost production. Damien filed his report with characteristic thoroughness, documenting every technical detail, every environmental concern, every recommendation for immediate action. He expected pushback, perhaps some negotiation over timelines or mitigation strategies. What he got instead was silence. Weeks passed without response from Triton. When Damien finally contacted the company directly, he was told that his report was under review and that they would respond in due course. More weeks passed. The platform continued operating. The leak continued spreading invisible contamination through some of the most productive fishing waters in the Gulf. Finally, Damien received a call from his supervisor at Gulf Coast Environmental. The message was delivered with the kind of careful language that corporate executives used when legal liability was a concern. Triton had decided to seek a second opinion on Platform Echo 12. Gulf Coast Environmental Services would no longer be required. Damien's report would be returned to the company and treated as confidential work product. That night, Damien sat in his home office staring at copies of his own technical analysis, wondering if he was losing his mind. The data was clear. The Conti photographs were unambiguous. The environmental threat was real and growing every day. Yet somehow, pointing out these facts had made him the problem rather than the solution. He tried calling other engineers who had worked on similar projects, seeking validation or advice, or simply someone who would confirm that he wasn't overreacting. Most were sympathetic but cautious. The oil industry was smaller than it appeared, and reputations traveled fast. Getting labeled as someone who caused expensive problems for clients was a career-ending designation. But Dr. Sarah Chun, a marine biologist who had worked with Damien on previous environmental assessments, agreed to review his findings. Sarah was brilliant, meticulous, and fearless in her commitment to scientific integrity. She had built her career studying the long-term effects of petroleum contamination on Gulf ecosystems, and she understood better than anyone what a hidden leak could do to marine life populations. After examining Damien's data, Sarah's conclusion was unequivocal. Platform Echo 12 was an environmental disaster waiting to explode into public view. The contamination was already affecting plankton populations, which would cascade up through the food chain in ways that could devastate commercial fishing for decades. Immediate action wasn't just recommended, it was essential. Together, they decided to contact the Environmental Protection Agency directly. If Triton wouldn't act responsibly, federal regulators would force them to. It was the right thing to do, the moral choice, the decision that their scientific training and professional ethics demanded. The EPA investigation that followed was thorough and damning. Platform Echo 12 was shut down within 2 weeks. Environmental remediation efforts began immediately. Triton Energy faced fines totaling $400 million in civil lawsuits that would drag on for years, and Damien Roulaine found himself unemployable in the petroleum industry. The retaliation was swift and comprehensive. Gulf Coast Environmental terminated his contract, citing incompatible professional priorities. Other engineering firms somehow always had fully staffed technical departments whenever his resume crossed their desks. Professional conferences that had once featured his presentations suddenly had no openings for his expertise. The message was clear and brutal. Engineers who cost oil companies hundreds of millions of dollars would not be working as engineers anymore. Sarah suffered a similar fate. Her research funding dried up. University positions became unavailable. Her reputation as a troublemaker preceded her wherever she applied. Eventually, she took a position with a small environmental consulting firm in California, as far from the Gulf as she could get while still working in her field. For Damien, the transition was more devastating. Engineering wasn't just his career, it was his identity. He had spent 15 years becoming an expert in one of the most technically demanding fields in the world, only to discover that expertise was worthless if it threatened the wrong corporate. Interests thought the divorce papers arrived 6 months later. Linda had tried to be supportive, but the financial pressure was enormous. Their mortgage on the house in Sugar Land was based on a petroleum engineer's salary, not an unemployed whistleblower's prospects. The private school tuition for their daughter Selene, the country club membership, the lifestyle they had built around professional success, all of it crumbled along with Damien's career. "I can't do this anymore," Linda said, her voice heavy with exhaustion rather than anger. "I can't watch you destroy yourself over principles that no one else seems to care about. Selene deserves stability, and I deserve a partner who can provide it." The custody arrangement gave Damien alternating weekends and one evening per week. It wasn't enough time with his daughter, but it was what the court determined was appropriate for someone whose employment situation was unstable and unpredictable. Selene was 12 then, old enough to understand that her family was falling apart but too young to grasp the complex forces that had torn it apart. She asked the kinds of questions that broke her father's heart. Why couldn't he just find another engineering job? Why did doing the right thing have to cost them everything? Why couldn't he just apologize and go back to the way things were before? Damien tried to explain about integrity, about responsibility, about the importance of protecting the environment, even when it was expensive or inconvenient. But how do you tell a 12-year-old that her father's principles had cost her the only home she had ever known? The jobs that followed were a steady descent down the economic ladder. Consulting work dried up when his reputation preceded him. Technical positions in other industries required certifications he didn't have and experience he couldn't demonstrate. Eventually, he found himself accepting whatever employment was available, each position a little further from his training, a little closer to the kind of work that paid by the hour rather than the year. Maintenance work at Titanium Tower represented a strange kind of full circle. Every night, he cleaned the offices of people who made the kinds of decisions he used to influence. He emptied the trash cans of executives who determined environmental policy for billions of dollars in oil operations. He vacuumed the carpets in conference rooms where deals were struck that could affect the entire Gulf ecosystem. It should have been humiliating, and sometimes it was, but it was also educational. Invisible in his maintenance uniform, Damien observed the inner workings of corporate power from a perspective he had never possessed as a highly paid consultant. He saw how decisions were really made, how environmental concerns were weighed against profit margins, how inconvenient truths were managed and contained, and sometimes, late at night when the 57th floor was empty except for the cleaning crew, he found documents in wastebaskets that told stories the public would never hear. Now, standing in Apex Energy's boardroom with the most powerful people in American oil staring at him in shock, Damien felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment. He could walk away, finish his shift, collect his paycheck, and let someone else worry about Meridian Platform, Delta 7. He could protect the quiet life he had built from the wreckage of his former existence, or he could do what he had always done. When confronted with evidence of environmental disaster, tell the truth and accept the consequences, no matter how devastating they might be. The decision had been made the moment he saw that first document in Victor Hillcrest's wastebasket. Everything that followed was just the inevitable result of being the kind of man who couldn't stay silent when silence meant letting a disaster unfold in slow motion. Somewhere in Sugarland, Selene was getting ready for school, probably wondering why her father worked nights and lived in a studio apartment instead of the life they used to have. She deserved better than the collateral damage from his choices, but she also deserved to inherit a world where someone was willing to speak up when corporations tried to hide. Environmental catastrophes. Standing there with Aria Lencourt's green eyes boring into him and $50 billion in contracts lying unsigned on the table, Damien hoped that someday his daughter would understand that some fights were worth having, even when winning meant losing everything else. The interrogation that followed felt like a court proceeding where the defendant, prosecutor, and jury were all seated around the same conference table. Aria had called for the boardroom to be sealed. No one entering or leaving until they could determine whether Damien Rouleau was a credible whistleblower or an elaborate saboteur. The contracts remained unsigned, $50 billion suspended in a state of quantum uncertainty, where everything and nothing was simultaneously true. Victor paced behind his chair with the restless energy of a caged predator. His silver hair catching the afternoon light that now streamed through the western windows of Titanium Tower. Every few minutes, he would stop and fix Damien with a stare that had reduced opposing counsel to stammering apologies, but the maintenance worker remained unmoved, answering questions with the patient precision of someone accustomed to explaining technical concepts to people who didn't want to understand them. "Let me understand your accusation," Victor said, his voice carrying the kind of prosecutorial tone that had made him legendary in energy sector litigation. "You claim that Meridian Offshore Holdings has concealed a significant oil leak for 8 months, falsified environmental compliance reports, and is essentially selling Apex Energy Corporation a $67 billion cleanup bill, disguised as a $50 billion asset acquisition." Damien nodded calmly. "That's correct. And your evidence for this extraordinary claim consists of a single document that you allegedly retrieved from my private office wastebasket, plus 6 weeks of additional observations, photographs of related documents, and technical analysis based on 7 years of experience with offshore drilling systems." Charles Whitmore, Apex's chief environmental officer, leaned forward with the kind of skeptical frown that had served him well in regulatory hearings. "Mr. Rouleau, even if we accept that you found this document, how do we know it's authentic? Corporate offices generate thousands of pages of preliminary reports, draft analyses, hypothetical scenarios. A single piece of paper doesn't constitute definitive proof of anything." Damien reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a small notebook, the kind used by maintenance workers to document repairs and service calls. But when he opened it, the pages revealed something entirely different. Detailed technical drawings, pressure calculations, environmental impact, projections, and photographs taken with telephoto equipment. 3 weeks ago, I started documenting everything I could find related to the Meridian acquisition," he said, his voice maintaining the same calm precision despite the mounting tension in the room. "Not just documents from wastebaskets, but patterns in meeting schedules, changes in executive behavior, communications that seemed designed to avoid creating permanent records." He flipped through several pages, each covered in handwriting that demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that seemed impossible for someone whose job description involved emptying trash cans and mopping floors. "For example," Damien continued, pointing to a series of calculations, "Meridian's reported oil production from platform Delta 7 has been declining at a rate of approximately 2% per month for the past 6 months. But their public financial filings show consistent production levels. The difference suggests they're supplementing reported production with stored reserves to maintain the illusion of operational efficiency. Heiress and Blake, whose family fortune was built on Texas oil, snorted with derision. This is absurd. We're supposed to believe that a janitor has conducted a more thorough due diligence analysis than teams of investment bankers, environmental consultants, and regulatory specialists. But Arya was studying the notebook pages with growing fascination. The technical drawings were too sophisticated to be fabricated, the calculations too precise to be guesswork. More troubling, several of the document fragments photographed in the notebook bore Meridian letterhead and executive signatures that she recognized from months of acquisition negotiations. "Mr. Roulaine," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "you mentioned additional observations. What exactly have you been observing?" Damien turned to a section of the notebook that contained what appeared to be surveillance photographs taken with a long-range lens. The images showed men in business suits meeting in locations that seemed deliberately remote. A parking garage, a marina, a construction site. 2 weeks ago, Victor met with Meridian CEO Jonathan Blackwood at a private club in Galveston, Damien said, indicating a photograph that clearly showed both men at a table overlooking the Gulf. The meeting wasn't on either of their official calendars. It lasted 3 hours. The next day, Meridian's environmental compliance officer resigned, citing personal reasons. Victor's face went white, then flushed red with what could have been anger or panic or both. "This is stalking. This is harassment. This man has been following me, photographing me, violating my privacy in ways that are probably criminal." "I work night shifts," Damien replied evenly. "I see a lot of things that happen after normal business hours, including late-night document shredding sessions in your office and emergency conference calls with Meridian executives about containment strategies that had nothing to do with oil drilling." The room erupted in chaos. Board members began talking over each other, voices rising with confusion and concern. Someone mentioned calling the FBI. Another suggested contacting Meridian immediately to demand an explanation. Charles Whitmore was already speed-dialing his contacts at the Environmental Protection Agency. But through the noise, Arya heard something that made her blood run cold. Her phone was buzzing with incoming text messages, and the preview screen showed alerts from financial news services. Stock prices, trading suspensions, something about Meridian Offshore Holdings, and unconfirmed reports of environmental violations. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The room fell silent. "Victor, get Jonathan Blackwood on the phone, now." Victor hesitated, and in that hesitation, Arya saw something she had never seen before in the man who had been her mentor, advisor, and fiancé: fear. "Arya, this isn't the right approach," he said, his voice carrying a pleading undertone that seemed utterly foreign to his usual confident demeanor. "We need to handle this through proper legal channels. Accusations of this magnitude require careful investigation, not panic reactions based on the ravings of a maintenance worker." But Arya was already dialing Meridian's corporate headquarters herself. The call went through to Jonathan Blackwood's executive assistant, who informed her that Mr. Blackwood was unavailable, traveling overseas on urgent business, and could not be reached for comment on any matters related to ongoing corporate negotiations. She hung up and stared at Victor, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their 2-year relationship. The expensive suit, the perfectly styled silver hair, the confident smile that had never wavered even in the most challenging negotiations. All of it suddenly seemed like costume jewelry, valuable from a distance, but revealed as fake under close examination. "When did you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Arya, you're being manipulated by a man who is clearly unstable. We need to. When did you know about the leak?" The silence that followed was deafening. Around the table, 12 of the most powerful people in American energy sat frozen, watching a drama unfold that could destroy not just the Meridian acquisition, but the reputation and future of everyone involved. Victor's phone rang, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet boardroom. He glanced at the caller ID, and something in his expression shifted from fear to panic. "I need to take this," he said, moving toward the door. "No." Arya's voice carried absolute authority. "Whatever conversation you're about to have, we're all going to hear it." Victor stopped, his hand on the door handle, his back to the room. When he finally turned around, the confident legal eagle who had dominated energy sector negotiations for 3 decades was gone. In his place stood a man who looked older than his 60 years, worn down by the weight of choices that were finally catching up with him. "The leak is real," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's been real for 8 months. And it's getting worse." The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Several board members actually gasped. Charles Whitmore dropped his phone. Harrison Blake began swearing in a low, steady stream that seemed to encompass 3 generations of oil industry profanity. But Arya felt something else entirely, not shock, or anger or panic, but a strange sense of clarity, as if a fog that had been obscuring her vision for months was finally lifting. "How much did they pay you?" she asked, her voice perfectly calm. Victor looked at her with something that might have been regret or relief or simple exhaustion. $50 million, he said. "Transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands over the past 6 months. Payment for ensuring that the acquisition went through without excessive environmental scrutiny." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. $50 million. A fortune that could buy almost anything, including the silence of one of the most respected energy lawyers in America. But as Arya looked around the room, she realized that Victor's betrayal was only the beginning. The Meridian acquisition wasn't just a bad deal disguised as a good one. It was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy designed to transfer the liability for one of the largest environmental disasters in Gulf of Mexico history from a smaller company that couldn't survive the cleanup costs to a larger one that might. And she had been 47 signatures away from walking voluntarily into the trap. Damien Rouleau stood quietly beside his maintenance cart, watching the most powerful people in American energy grapple with the realization that their carefully constructed world was built on foundations that were crumbling beneath their feet. He had seen this before in other boardrooms, other industries, other moments when inconvenient truths finally overwhelmed comfortable lies. The difference was that this time, someone had listened before it was too late. Outside the windows of Titanium Tower, the Houston skyline continued its eternal dance with the sun, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in the rarefied air of executive suites. But inside the 57th floor boardroom, everything had changed in the space of 2 hours. $50 billion in contracts lay unsigned and suddenly toxic. A carefully orchestrated acquisition had been revealed as an elaborate fraud. And a man with a mop had just prevented one of the largest corporate disasters in American history. The question now was whether anyone would survive the aftermath. The retaliation came with the swift, surgical precision that only institutional power could deliver. Within 18 hours of Victor Halcrest's confession in the Titanium Tower boardroom, both Damien Rouleau and Arya Lencourt discovered that speaking truth to power carried a price that extended far beyond personal embarrassment or professional inconvenience. Damien was the first to feel the consequences. He arrived at his studio apartment in Southeast Houston Tuesday evening to find 2 men in dark suits waiting beside a black sedan parked at the curb. They weren't police officers, though they carried themselves with the kind of authority that made neighbors retreat behind curtains and pretend not to notice whatever was happening on their quiet residential street. "Mr. Rouleau," the taller man said, his voice carrying the flat professional tone of someone accustomed to delivering unpleasant news. "I'm Agent Morrison, FBI, Financial Crimes Division. This is Agent Rodriguez." We need to discuss your recent activities at Apex Energy Corporation. The investigation that followed was thorough and devastating. Federal agents seized Damien's computer, his camera, his maintenance notebook, and every document he had accumulated during his months of documenting the Meridian conspiracy. The search warrant was comprehensive, covering everything from potential corporate espionage to violation of federal computer fraud statutes. Taking photographs of confidential corporate documents constitutes theft of trade secrets under federal law, Agent Morrison explained as his partner inventoried Damien's possessions. Accessing areas of corporate facilities without proper authorization violates the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The penalties can include up to 20 years in federal prison. But the legal threats were only the beginning. By Wednesday morning, Damien's employment at Titanium Tower had been terminated for gross violation of security protocols and breach of confidential employer information. The termination letter, signed by Apex's Human Resources Director, made clear that any future employment reference would include detailed information about his criminal investigation for corporate espionage activities. More devastating was the call from Linda, his ex-wife, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that meant lawyers had been involved. "They're challenging the custody arrangement," she said without preamble. "Cellini's stepfather has hired a family court attorney. They're claiming that your current legal troubles make you an unfit parent. The documentation was already filed, complete with newspaper clippings about the FBI investigation, employment termination records, and psychological evaluations suggesting that Damien displayed paranoid ideation and obsessive behavior patterns consistent with industrial espionage activities." The petition requested immediate suspension of his visitation rights, pending resolution of all criminal charges. Damien sat in his empty apartment that evening, stripped of his possessions, his employment, his access to his daughter, and facing the possibility of spending the next 2 decades in federal prison for trying to prevent an environmental disaster. The irony was bitter. 7 years after being destroyed for exposing one oil industry cover-up, he was being destroyed again for exposing another. But Damien's persecution was modest compared to what Apex Energy Corporation unleashed against Aria Lencourt. The board meeting that convened Thursday morning was unlike anything in the company's 90-year history. Aria arrived to find 12 directors who had supported her leadership for 3 years, now regarding her with the kind of careful neutrality that preceded a corporate execution. The conference table where she had once commanded absolute authority now felt like a tribunal where she was simultaneously prosecutor, defendant, and evidence. Harrison Blake, whose family had been partners with the Lencourt since the 1940s, delivered the verdict with the kind of regretful formality reserved for family betrayals. "Aria, the board has received preliminary reports from our legal team regarding the Meridian situation. The implications are catastrophic, not just for the acquisition, but for Apex's entire position in the energy sector." The legal analysis was comprehensive and damning. If Damien's allegations proved accurate, Apex faced potential liability extending far beyond the $50 billion acquisition price. Environmental cleanup costs, federal penalties, civil lawsuits from affected communities, and regulatory sanctions could easily reach $100 billion or more. "But more concerning," Blake continued, "is the revelation that you made acquisition decisions based on allegations from a maintenance worker, rather than following established due diligence protocols. The board has lost confidence in your judgment and your ability to lead the corporation through this crisis." The motion of no confidence passed by a vote of 11 to 1, with only Charles Whitmore supporting Aria's continued leadership. The board's statement, released to financial media within hours, was brief and devastating. "Ms. Lencourt has been relieved of her executive duties, pending a comprehensive investigation of recent corporate governance failures." But the professional humiliation was only the beginning. Victor Hillcrest, despite his confession to taking $50 million in bribes, had retained one of the most prestigious criminal defense firms in Texas. His attorneys immediately went on the offensive, painting him as the victim of an elaborate entrapment scheme orchestrated by corporate rivals, seeking to destroy the Meridian acquisition. Mr. Hillcrest was approached by individuals claiming to represent environmental activist organizations. His lead attorney announced at a press conference Thursday afternoon. These individuals provided him with fabricated documents designed to create the appearance of environmental violations. When he attempted to investigate these claims, he was secretly recorded and subsequently blackmailed into making false confessions. The narrative was elegant in its simplicity. Victor was an honest lawyer who had been manipulated by eco-terrorists working in collaboration with corporate saboteurs. Damien was portrayed as an unstable former engineer with a history of making false environmental accusations. Aria was depicted as an inexperienced heiress who had allowed herself to be manipulated by criminals, seeking to destabilize American energy independence. The media coverage that followed was brutal and comprehensive. Cable news channels ran continuous analysis of corporate espionage in the energy sector and when environmental activism becomes economic terrorism. Financial networks questioned whether young executives like Aria were equipped to handle the complex challenges of modern energy corporations. Most damaging were the carefully leaked details about Damien's personal history. His previous whistleblowing incident at Triton Energy was reframed as evidence of a pattern of making false accusations against oil companies. His divorce was attributed to obsessive behavior and inability to maintain stable employment. His current legal troubles were presented as inevitable consequences of escalating anti-corporate activities. By Friday, Damien had been evicted from his apartment for creating a security risk for other tenants, and was living in his 20-year-old Honda Civic in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. His court-appointed attorney, overwhelmed with cases and lacking resources for complex federal investigations, advised him to consider a plea agreement that would involve admitting to corporate espionage charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. "The evidence against you is substantial," the public defender explained with the weary resignation of someone who had handled too many hopeless cases. Photographs of confidential documents, unauthorized access to restricted areas, violation of employment agreements. The prosecutor has a strong case, and going to trial could result in a much harsher sentence. Aria's situation was different but equally devastating. Stripped of her executive position and facing personal liability that could exceed her family's net worth, she found herself isolated from the network of relationships that had defined her entire adult life. Former allies in the energy sector suddenly had scheduling conflicts when she requested meetings. Social invitations dried up. Even her country club membership was quietly suspended pending resolution of her legal difficulties. The mansion in River Oaks, her family's estate for 3 generations, was placed in trust pending the outcome of civil lawsuits related to the Meridian acquisition. She found herself living in a downtown hotel, cut off from the resources and support systems that had always insulated her from the consequences of difficult decisions. But perhaps most painful was the discovery that many people she had considered friends and allies were actively participating in her destruction. Former board members gave interviews questioning her competence and stability. Business associates distanced themselves from what they characterized as her reckless decision-making. Even family members suggested that perhaps it was time for her to step back from business responsibilities and focus on personal recovery. The message was clear: challenging the established order carried consequences that extended far beyond individual careers or corporate positions. It threatened relationships, reputations, and the entire social fabric that connected powerful people in industries built on mutual trust and shared interests. Late Friday night, Aria sat in her hotel room, staring at her reflection in the darkened windows that overlooked downtown Houston. The city sparkled below her like a constellation of possibilities that suddenly seemed as distant as actual stars. She had inherited one of the most powerful positions in American energy, and had managed to lose it in less than a week by listening to a janitor who claimed to care about environmental protection. The rational choice was clear: apologize for her poor judgment, accept responsibility for the disruption she had caused, and negotiate a quiet settlement that would allow everyone to move forward without admitting any wrongdoing. Victor's attorneys had already reached out through intermediaries, suggesting that all parties could benefit from a coordinated response that minimized legal exposure and media attention. But as Arya contemplated surrendering to the forces arrayed against her, she found herself thinking about Damien Roulean, sleeping in his car in a diner parking lot because he had tried to prevent an environmental disaster. She thought about the photographs in his notebook, the technical calculations that demonstrated a level of expertise that belied his maintenance worker disguise, and the quiet determination in his voice when he had warned her not to sign a contract that would have destroyed her company. Most of all, she thought about Selene, the daughter who was being used as leverage to silence her father's inconvenient truths. A 16-year-old girl who might grow up believing that speaking out against powerful interests was a form of mental illness rather than moral courage. The question that kept Arya awake that night wasn't whether she could survive the consequences of challenging the Meridian conspiracy. The question was whether she could survive the consequences of not challenging it, of becoming the kind of person who chose comfort over truth when the stakes were measured in environmental destruction and corporate fraud. Outside her hotel window, Houston glittered in the darkness like a circuit board carrying the electrical impulses of American capitalism. Somewhere in that sprawling urban landscape, Damien Roulean was probably staring at the same skyline, wondering if doing the right thing was worth destroying everything he had built from the wreckage of his previous attempt at moral courage. Neither of them knew it yet. But help was coming from the most unexpected source imaginable: a 16-year-old girl who had inherited her father's stubbornness and her grandfather's determination to fight battles that others considered unwinnable. Selene Roulean had inherited more than her father's dark eyes and analytical mind. She had also inherited his inability to stay quiet when she witnessed injustice, even when speaking up threatened to make a bad situation infinitely worse. At 16, she possessed the kind of righteous fury that adults had learned to temper with experience, but also the digital literacy and social media savvy that her father's generation struggled to understand, while Damien slept fitfully in his Honda Civic behind a downtown diner, and Arya stared at legal documents in her hotel room. Selene was conducting her own investigation from the public library computer lab at her high school. She had been monitoring news coverage of her father's legal troubles with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that mainstream media rarely told the complete story. What she discovered made her sick with anger. The narrative being constructed around her father was carefully crafted to destroy not just his credibility, but his humanity. Headlines described him as troubled former engineer, turned corporate saboteur, and environmental extremist linked to anti-energy terrorism. The articles quoted unnamed sources describing his erratic behavior and obsessive fixation on corporate conspiracies. But Selene knew her father. She had grown up listening to his bedtime stories about offshore drilling platforms and environmental protection systems. She had watched him spend hours explaining complex engineering concepts to her friends when they visited for school projects. She had seen the careful way he maintained his technical notebooks, the pride he took in solving problems that others considered impossible. More importantly, she had access to something that law enforcement officers and corporate attorneys and federal investigators had overlooked: her father's complete professional history, preserved in digital files that he had maintained throughout his career. Working with the methodical patience that her father had taught her, Selene began assembling a comprehensive timeline of Damien's professional expertise. She downloaded copies of his published research papers from engineering journals, She located photographs from industry conferences where he had presented technical innovations. She found testimonials from former colleagues who had praised his environmental protection work. Most crucially, she discovered something that the FBI had apparently missed during their investigation: digital correspondence between her father and Dr. Sarah Chun, the marine biologist who had supported his previous whistleblowing efforts. The emails, preserved in an encrypted cloud storage account, provided detailed technical analysis of offshore drilling, environmental impacts dating back 7 years. The correspondence revealed a pattern that directly contradicted the official narrative about Damien's mental state and professional competence. Rather than showing obsessive behavior or paranoid ideation, the emails demonstrated systematic, scientifically rigorous analysis of environmental threats that had been consistently validated by subsequent events. But Cellini's most important discovery came from an unexpected source: social media posts by Meridian Offshore Holdings employees that had been inadvertently preserved despite corporate attempts to control information flow. Using reverse image search and metadata analysis techniques she had learned from online privacy courses, Cellini traced photographs posted by Meridian workers on platforms that their management probably didn't monitor. The images, taken over several months and posted with casual captions about work life on offshore platforms, revealed equipment problems and environmental concerns that directly supported her father's allegations. One photograph, posted 6 weeks earlier by a rig maintenance technician, showed what appeared to be oil staining around underwater equipment, with the casual caption, "Another day fixing leaks in paradise." The image metadata indicated it had been taken at platform Delta 7, the exact location her father had identified as the source of environmental contamination. Working through the weekend, Cellini compiled her findings into a comprehensive digital presentation that combined her father's professional credentials, his technical analysis of the Meridian situation, and photographic evidence from multiple independent sources. The presentation was thorough, well-documented, and devastating to the carefully constructed narrative about corporate espionage and environmental extremism. But Celine understood that having evidence and getting people to pay attention to evidence were entirely different challenges. The mainstream media was focused on the corporate espionage angle. Federal investigators were building their criminal case, and powerful interests were working systematically to discredit anyone who challenged the official story. What she needed was someone with the credibility and platform to force serious examination of the evidence she had assembled. Someone who couldn't be easily dismissed as a troubled teenager supporting her troubled father. That someone turned out to be Dr. Elena Draycott. Dr. Draycott was one of the most respected environmental scientists in America, a professor at Rice University whose research on Gulf of Mexico ecosystems had influenced federal environmental policy for 2 decades. She had testified before Congress about offshore drilling risks, consulted with international organizations about marine pollution, and published research that was cited by environmental lawyers around the world. More importantly for Cellini's purposes, Dr. Draycott had a reputation for intellectual courage that transcended political considerations. She had criticized both Democratic and Republican administrations when their environmental policies contradicted scientific evidence. She had challenged major oil companies when their safety protocols proved inadequate. She had also defended responsible energy development when environmental activists made scientifically unsupportable claims. Cellini sent her comprehensive presentation to Dr. Draycott on Sunday evening, along with a personal letter that she had written and rewritten a dozen times. Dr. Draycott, my father is being destroyed for trying to prevent an environmental disaster that could affect Gulf ecosystems for generations. I know that sounds like something an angry daughter would say to defend her father, but I have evidence that I think you should examine. Not because of who my father is, but because of what the evidence shows about what's happening in the Gulf right now. Dr. Draycott's response came Tuesday morning, brief and professional. Ms. Roulaine, I've reviewed your materials. Can you and your father meet with me Thursday afternoon? I have some questions about the technical analysis, and there are some people I think you should meet. The meeting that followed changed everything. Dr. Draycott's office at Rice University overlooked the Texas Medical Center, its windows providing a panoramic view of one of the largest concentrations of research institutions in America. The walls were lined with scientific journals, technical reports, and photographs from research expeditions to locations around the world where environmental protection intersected with economic development. But it was the other people in the office who made Celine realize that her digital presentation had accomplished more than she had dared to hope. Dr. Martinez was a former EPA regional administrator who now worked as an independent environmental consultant. His expertise in federal environmental law had made him a sought-after expert witness in cases involving major corporations and environmental violations. Dr. Thornwell was a petroleum engineer whose 40 years of offshore drilling experience included stints with major oil companies, regulatory agencies, and international environmental organizations. He had investigated some of the largest oil spills in history and had testified in congressional hearings about offshore drilling safety. Agent Susan Caraway was perhaps the most important person in the room. She worked for the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit, a specialized division that investigated cases involving environmental violations, corporate fraud, and environmental terrorism. Unlike the agents who had arrested Damien, Agent Caraway's expertise was in distinguishing between legitimate environmental concerns and false accusations. Mr. Roulaine, Dr. Draycott began, your daughter has presented evidence that suggests serious environmental violations are being covered up through what appears to be an orchestrated campaign to discredit whistleblowers. Agent Caraway has reviewed the materials and believes there are grounds for a federal environmental crimes investigation. The technical review that followed was exhaustive and damning. Dr. Thornwell confirmed that Damien's engineering analysis was accurate and professionally competent. Dr. Martinez verified that the environmental concerns were legitimate and legally significant. Agent Caraway established that the evidence suggested a pattern of corporate fraud designed to conceal environmental violations, but perhaps most importantly, Dr. Draycott's independent analysis of water quality data from the Gulf revealed contamination patterns that directly supported Damien's allegations about Platform Delta 7. The contamination signature was subtle but unmistakable to experts who knew what to look for. Mr. Roulaine, Agent Caraway said, I believe you've been charged with the wrong crimes by agents who don't understand the difference between environmental protection and corporate espionage. I'm going to recommend that the charges against you be dropped and that a federal environmental crimes investigation be opened immediately. The reversal happened with stunning speed. By Thursday evening, federal prosecutors had quietly dropped all charges against Damien pending further investigation. By Friday morning, Meridian Offshore Holdings stock had been suspended from trading pending SEC investigation of environmental disclosure violations. By Friday afternoon, congressional committee chairs were announcing oversight hearings about offshore drilling safety and corporate environmental fraud. The narrative that had seemed so carefully constructed began unraveling with the same systematic precision that had created it. Media outlets that had portrayed Damien as an unstable corporate saboteur suddenly discovered that he was actually a respected environmental engineer with a track record of identifying serious safety problems. Legal experts who had dismissed his allegations as paranoid fantasies began acknowledging that his technical analysis was scientifically sound. Most importantly, other Meridian employees began coming forward with additional evidence of environmental cover-ups, safety violations, and corporate policies designed to conceal problems rather than solve them. The trickle of whistleblower reports became a flood as federal investigators offered protection to employees who had been afraid to speak out. But the most significant change was in public perception of Aria Lencourt. Rather than being portrayed as an inexperienced heiress who had been manipulated by corporate saboteurs, she was increasingly described as a responsible executive who had courageously refused to complete an acquisition that would have transferred environmental liabilities to her company. The board that had voted to remove her began receiving calls from major shareholders questioning the wisdom of punishing an executive for avoiding a catastrophic business decision. Legal analysts noted that her refusal to sign the Meridian contracts had potentially saved Apex from liabilities that could have bankrupted the company. By the following Monday, Aria was back in the Titanium Tower boardroom, not as a defendant in corporate proceedings, but as the CEO whose quick thinking had prevented one of the largest environmental and financial disasters in American business history. The reversal was so complete and dramatic that it felt almost surreal. But as Selene sat in Dr. Draycott's office, watching her father coordinate with federal investigators about the environmental crimes case, she realized that the real victory wasn't in the vindication or the restored reputations or the legal proceedings that would follow. The real victory was in proving that truth could still triumph over power, that evidence could still overcome propaganda, and that ordinary people could still force extraordinary institutions to acknowledge inconvenient realities. It had taken a teenager with a laptop to accomplish what teams of corporate lawyers and federal investigators had been unable or unwilling to do: look beyond the surface narrative to discover what was actually happening beneath the carefully constructed facade of corporate respectability. The congressional hearing that convened 3 weeks later would be remembered as one of the most explosive environmental investigations in American political history. The Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources had transformed its ornate hearing room into what resembled a war crimes tribunal, with witnesses, evidence, and documentation that would ultimately expose one of the largest environmental cover-ups in corporate America. Chairman Senator Roberts, whose 30 years in Congress had made him a master of extracting truth from reluctant witnesses, opened the proceedings with the kind of statement that immediately signaled this would be no ordinary political theater. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the packed hearing room, "we are here to investigate allegations that major American energy corporations have engaged in systematic fraud, environmental destruction, and witness intimidation to conceal what may be the largest ongoing oil spill in Gulf of Mexico history." The witness table stretched across the front of the room like a judicial bench, accommodating the key players whose testimony would determine not just the fate of individuals and corporations, but the future of American offshore drilling regulation. Aria Lencourt sat at one end of the table, no longer the embattled CEO who had been stripped of her position weeks earlier, but a composed executive whose decision to halt the Meridian acquisition had saved her company from catastrophic liability. She wore a navy blue business suit that projected competence and authority, her testimony folder organized with the methodical precision that had made her successful in the energy sector. Beside her, Damien Roulaine looked uncomfortable in the Wago borrowed suit that Dr. Draycott had insisted he wear for his television appearance. But his discomfort came not from unfamiliarity with formal proceedings, but from the knowledge that his testimony would destroy careers, corporations, and potentially entire segments of the offshore drilling industry. Victor Hillcrest sat at the opposite end of the table, flanked by 3 criminal defense attorneys whose combined legal fees probably exceeded most people's annual salaries. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expression carefully neutral, but something in his eyes suggested the haunted look of someone who understood that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse in spectacular public fashion. But it was the empty chair between Victor and the other witnesses that commanded the most attention. Jonathan Blackwood, CEO of Meridian Offshore Holdings, had fled the country 2 days before the hearing, taking refuge in a non-extradition country while his company faced federal criminal charges, environmental cleanup costs, and civil lawsuits that could exceed $100 billion. Senator Roberts called Aria as the first witness, understanding that her testimony would establish the timeline and corporate context that would make the subsequent revelations comprehensible to both committee members and television audiences. Ms. Lencourt, he began, please describe the circumstances that led you to halt the Meridian acquisition on the day contracts were scheduled to be signed. Aria's testimony was calm, precise, and devastating. She described the $50 billion acquisition as it had been presented to her board, the months of due diligence that had apparently missed massive environmental violations, and the moment when Damien Roulene's warning had forced her to question everything she thought she knew about the deal. At what point did you realize that you were not acquiring an asset, but inheriting a liability? Senator Roberts asked. When Mr. Roulene showed me evidence that Meridian's reported oil production numbers didn't match their actual extraction rates, Aria replied. The discrepancy suggested they were either concealing production problems or environmental losses. Given the technical expertise he demonstrated, I felt obligated to investigate further before committing $50 billion to what might be a fraudulent transaction. But it was during questioning by Senator Williams, the committee's ranking minority member, that Aria's testimony became truly explosive. Ms. Lencourt, were you aware that your legal counsel and fiancé, Victor Heiress, had received significant financial compensation from parties connected to the Meridian acquisition? The question hung in the air like an electrical charge. Aria glanced toward Victor, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since their relationship had begun 2 years earlier. I learned during the boardroom confrontation that Mr. Heiress had received $50 million from offshore accounts connected to Meridian Holdings, she said, her voice remaining steady despite the personal betrayal the words represented. This compensation was not disclosed to me, to the Apex Board, or to regulatory authorities as required by federal securities law. The hearing room erupted in murmurs and camera clicks. Victor's attorneys immediately huddled around him, but the damage was done. Federal prosecutors in the audience were already taking notes for additional criminal charges. When Damien was called to testify, the hearing room fell silent with the kind of anticipation that preceded historic moments. Here was the maintenance worker who had single-handedly exposed a conspiracy involving billions of dollars and environmental destruction that could affect Gulf ecosystems for decades. Roberts began with the obvious question, Mr. Roulene, how did a building maintenance worker gain access to confidential information about one of the largest energy acquisitions in American history? Damien's answer was simple and devastating. Senator, I didn't gain access to anything. I was just paying attention to what was already visible to anyone who bothered to look. He described his background as a petroleum engineer, his previous experience with environmental cover-ups, and the systematic way he had documented evidence of the Meridian conspiracy. But it was when he began describing the technical details of Platform Delta 7's environmental violations that his testimony became truly compelling. Senator, the leak at Platform Delta 7 is currently releasing approximately 800 barrels of crude oil per day into the Gulf of Mexico, he said, referring to updated estimates based on federal investigation findings. That's equivalent to a major oil spill occurring every single month, except it's happening below the surface where it's not visible to routine monitoring. He pulled out enlarged photographs that federal investigators had taken of the underwater wellhead images that showed environmental damage far worse than anyone had initially suspected. This isn't just an environmental violation, Damien continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years studying these systems. This is an environmental catastrophe that was being systematically concealed to protect corporate profits and stock prices. But the most dramatic moment came when Senator Roberts asked about the personal cost of Damien's decision to expose the cover-up. Mr. Roulene, you lost your job, your apartment, access to your daughter, and faced potential federal prison time for bringing this information to light. Do you regret your decision? Damien looked toward the gallery where Celine sat beside Dr. Draycott, her eyes bright with pride, despite everything their family had endured. Senator, my daughter is going to inherit the world that we leave behind. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent while that world was being poisoned for corporate profit. Some things are more important than personal comfort. The hearing room fell silent, the weight of moral courage settling over the proceedings like a benediction. But it was Victor Hillcrest's testimony that provided the most explosive revelations of the day. Faced with federal criminal charges, SEC violations, and evidence that his co-conspirators had abandoned him to face consequences alone, Victor chose cooperation over continued denial. His testimony, delivered in the flat monotone of someone who had already lost everything that mattered, to him revealed a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the Meridian acquisition. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, he said, avoiding eye contact with Arya as he described betraying everything she had trusted him to protect. Meridian would sell their assets at inflated prices to companies large enough to absorb environmental cleanup costs. The acquiring companies would discover the environmental problems after the transactions were completed, when legal remedies would be limited and expensive. He described a network of corrupt lawyers, executives, and regulatory officials who had facilitated similar acquisitions across the energy sector, transferring environmental liabilities from smaller companies to larger ones through fraudulent transactions. How many acquisitions involved similar concealment of environmental violations? Senator Roberts asked. Victor's answer sent shockwaves through the energy sector. Over the past 5 years, approximately $37 billion in energy acquisitions have involved undisclosed environmental liabilities. The total cleanup costs could exceed $200 billion. The hearing room erupted in chaos. Reporters scrambled to contact news desks. Stock prices of major energy companies began plummeting in real time. Congressional staff began calculating the implications for federal environmental policy and energy sector regulation. But perhaps the most important moment came during closing statements, when Chairman Roberts addressed the fundamental questions raised by the investigation. This hearing has revealed that some of America's largest corporations have engaged in systematic fraud to conceal environmental destruction, he said. But it has also revealed that ordinary citizens, when they have the courage to speak truth to power, can expose corruption that threatens our economy and environment. He looked directly at Damien and Celine in the gallery. Mr. Roulaine, your decision to risk everything to expose this conspiracy has potentially prevented one of the largest environmental disasters in American history. Miss Roulaine, your investigation and advocacy have demonstrated that young people can hold powerful institutions accountable when adults fail to do so. The gavel fell with the finality of justice served, but everyone in the hearing room understood that the real work was just beginning. Environmental cleanup, criminal prosecutions, regulatory reform, and corporate accountability measures would take years to implement. But on that afternoon in Washington, with cameras broadcasting live coverage around the world, a maintenance worker and a teenage girl had proven that truth could still triumph over power, that courage could still overcome corruption, and that ordinary people could still force extraordinary institutions to acknowledge their responsibilities to society and the environment. The age of corporate environmental accountability had begun. Sparked by a man with a mop who had refused to stay silent when silence meant letting a disaster unfold in slow motion, the justice that followed the congressional hearing was swift, comprehensive, and unprecedented in the history of American corporate environmental crimes. Within 60 days of Victor Hillcrest's devastating testimony, federal prosecutors had secured indictments against 47 individuals connected to what media outlets were calling the Meridian Conspiracy. Victor himself received the harshest sentence, 18 years in federal prison for racketeering, environmental fraud, securities violations, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. The $50 million in bribes he had received was seized and redirected to Gulf of Mexico environmental restoration efforts. His law license was permanently revoked, and his assets were frozen pending civil litigation from damaged parties. But Victor's punishment was only the beginning. Jonathan Blackwood, the fugitive Meridian CEO, was arrested 3 months later when Swiss authorities froze his offshore accounts and expelled him from their jurisdiction. His extradition to the United States led to additional revelations about international money laundering operations that had facilitated environmental cover-ups across multiple countries. Meridian Offshore Holdings ceased to exist as a corporate entity, its assets liquidated to fund the largest environmental cleanup operation in American history. Platform Delta 7 and 6 other drilling installations were permanently shut down, their equipment salvaged, and their environmental damage systematically remediated using techniques that would become the gold standard for offshore restoration. Efforts. The Environmental Protection Agency, emboldened by congressional support and public outrage, implemented the most comprehensive offshore drilling regulations since the Clean Water Act. The new standards required real-time environmental monitoring, independent safety inspections, and financial guarantees that would cover potential cleanup costs before drilling permits could be approved. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the transformation of Apex Energy Corporation itself. Aria Lencourt returned to her position as CEO with a mandate from shareholders, board members, and regulators to rebuild the company around principles of environmental responsibility and corporate transparency. The $50 billion that would have been wasted on the Meridian acquisition was instead invested in renewable energy research, environmental protection technology, and community restoration programs throughout the Gulf Coast region. We learned that the most expensive deal you can make is the one that looks profitable until you understand its true costs. Aria announced at the company's annual shareholders meeting 6 months after the congressional hearing. Apex will never again prioritize short-term profits over long-term environmental responsibility. The commitment wasn't merely rhetorical. Under Aria's leadership, Apex became the first major American oil company to establish an independent environmental oversight board with authority to halt any project that posed unacceptable environmental risks. The board included marine biologists, environmental lawyers, and community representatives with power equal to traditional corporate directors. Damien Roulene's professional rehabilitation was even more dramatic. Dr. Elena Draycott recommended him for a senior position with the EPA's new Environmental Crimes Prevention Unit, where his expertise in detecting corporate environmental fraud became invaluable for preventing future conspiracies. His salary as a federal environmental investigator exceeded what he had earned as a private sector engineer. But more importantly, his work carried the kind of moral authority that had always driven his career choices, the custody battle over Cellini was resolved when Linda, embarrassed by media coverage that portrayed her as complicit in silencing environmental whistleblowing, voluntarily restored Damien's full parental rights. Cellini chose to live with her father, partly because of his professional vindication, but mostly because she had learned that courage was more valuable than comfort. "Dad," she said on the evening when his federal appointment was announced, "I'm proud that you're my father. Not because of your new job, but because you never gave up on doing the right thing." Cellini's own role in exposing the conspiracy led to opportunities that surprised everyone, including herself. Her digital investigation techniques and social media analysis had impressed law enforcement professionals, leading to an internship with the FBI's Cybercrime Division while she completed high school. Major universities began recruiting her for computer science and environmental law programs, recognizing that her combination of technical skills and moral courage represented the future of environmental protection. The environmental cleanup itself became a model for international cooperation and technological innovation. Scientists from 12 countries collaborated on developing new methods for removing oil contamination from deep water ecosystems. The techniques pioneered in the Gulf of Mexico cleanup were subsequently applied to environmental restoration projects around the world, creating a new industry focused on repairing rather than merely preventing environmental damage. Community impact extended far beyond environmental restoration. The federal fines and asset seizures generated over $4 billion in compensation for Gulf Coast fishing communities, tourism businesses, and environmental organizations affected by the concealed oil spills. Rather than simply distributing cash payments, the compensation program funded long-term economic development projects that reduced regional dependence on offshore drilling while maintaining employment levels. The media coverage that had initially portrayed Damien as an unstable corporate saboteur evolved into celebration of his courage and expertise. Documentary filmmakers, book publishers, and environmental organizations saw his collaboration on projects designed to educate the public about corporate environmental accountability. But Damien consistently declined opportunities that would have made him wealthy or famous, preferring to focus on the systematic work of preventing future environmental crimes. "I'm not interested in being a celebrity," he told reporters who requested interviews about his transformation from janitor to environmental hero. "I'm interested in making sure that other people in similar situations know they can speak up without being destroyed for telling the truth." The legal precedents established by the Meridian prosecutions fundamentally changed corporate behavior. Throughout the energy sector, environmental lawyers reported that companies were voluntarily disclosing potential problems, rather than risking the kind of catastrophic liability that had destroyed Meridian and its co-conspirators. Insurance companies began requiring independent environmental assessments before providing coverage for major energy projects. Most significantly, the Meridian investigation demonstrated that environmental protection and economic prosperity were compatible rather than contradictory objectives. Apex Energy's stock price reached record highs as investors recognized that companies committed to environmental responsibility were less likely to face regulatory sanctions, cleanup costs, and reputation damage that could destroy shareholder value. The transformation was so complete that it felt almost surreal, as if the entire American energy sector had suddenly awakened from a collective delusion about the relationship between profits and environmental stewardship. But as Damien understood from his years of studying complex systems, sometimes dramatic change happened not gradually, but all at once. When accumulated pressures finally overcame institutional resistance to acknowledging inconvenient truths. Standing in his new office at EPA headquarters, looking out at the Potomac River, where environmental protection had become national policy during the 1970s, Damien reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from a maintenance closet to federal law enforcement. The view reminded him that environmental protection was not a luxury that society could afford during prosperous times, but a fundamental requirement for long-term survival that transcended political considerations and corporate interests. Justice had been served, consequences had been enforced, and the system had demonstrated its capacity for self-correction when presented with undeniable evidence of wrongdoing. But the real victory was not in punishing those who had chosen profits over environmental responsibility, but in creating conditions where future decision-makers would understand that protecting the environment was the most profitable strategy of all. 2 years later, the transformation was complete, but not forgotten. On a warm Houston morning, Aria Lencourt stood before the gleaming facade of the newly opened Roulaine Environmental Research Center, a $200 million facility that Apex Energy had built on the banks of Buffalo Bayou. The building's solar panels and wind turbines generated more energy than it consumed, while its laboratories pioneered the kind of environmental protection technology that was becoming the new standard for American energy companies. The dedication ceremony was small and purposeful, attended by environmental scientists, federal regulators, and community leaders rather than the corporate executives and political figures who typically populated such events. Arya had learned that meaningful change happened not through grand gestures and media spectacles, but through patient work by people who understood that protecting the environment was ultimately about protecting human communities. Damien arrived with Celine, both wearing the kind of casual business attire that suggested comfort with their transformed circumstances, but lack of interest in displaying wealth or status. Celine, now 18 and headed to MIT in the fall to study environmental engineering, carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that individual courage could create systemic change. "Dad," she said as they walked toward the research center's entrance, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that day?" Damien considered the question with the same systematic thoughtfulness he brought to technical problems. "I think about the 800 barrels of oil that were leaking into the Gulf every day, and how much worse it would have gotten if it had continued for another year or two. But mostly I think about you, and whether I would have been able to look at you knowing I had stayed silent when I could have prevented an environmental disaster." The research center's mission was simple but revolutionary: develop technologies and policies that made environmental protection profitable rather than expensive. The scientists and engineers working there understood that the most sustainable environmental policies were those that aligned corporate interests with ecological preservation, creating economic incentives for behavior that protected rather than damaged natural systems. Inside the center's main auditorium, Arya delivered remarks that would have been unthinkable from a major oil company CEO just 2 years earlier. "We've learned that environmental protection isn't a cost of doing business," she said to the assembled researchers and policymakers. "It's the foundation of sustainable business. Companies that damage the environment ultimately damage themselves, their shareholders, and their communities." But it was Damien's brief comments that captured the broader meaning of their shared experience. 2 years ago, I was cleaning office buildings because I had been blacklisted for trying to prevent environmental damage," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had survived institutional retaliation and emerged stronger. "Today, I work with some of the brightest environmental scientists in the world to develop policies that will prevent future environmental crimes before they happen." He looked toward Celine, who was recording his remarks for a documentary about corporate environmental accountability that she was producing for her college applications. "But the most important thing I learned wasn't about environmental science or corporate fraud. I learned that staying silent in the face of wrongdoing doesn't protect anyone, including yourself. The only real security comes from having the courage to speak truth to power, even when the consequences seem overwhelming." The applause that followed was modest but sustained, the kind of recognition that comes from people who understand the difference between celebrity and genuine accomplishment. As the ceremony concluded and guests toured the research laboratories, Damien found himself standing beside Arya on the building's observation deck, looking out over the Houston skyline where so much of their story had unfolded. The Titanium Tower gleamed in the distance, its reflective surface catching the afternoon sun just as it had on the morning when a maintenance worker had walked into a boardroom and changed the course of American environmental policy. "Do you ever regret it?" Arya asked, echoing her daughter's earlier question, but with a different emphasis. "Not just speaking up, but everything that followed?" Damien smiled, and for the first time in years, the expression reached his eyes. "I regret that it took so long for people to listen," he said. "But I don't regret trying to prevent an environmental disaster, even when it meant losing everything I thought was important." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city, where their lives had been transformed by the simple decision to choose truth over convenience. Somewhere in the distance, the Gulf of Mexico sparkled under restored environmental protections, its waters cleaner than they had been in decades, thanks to the technological innovations and policy changes that had emerged from their unlikely partnership. The story was complete, but its impact continued rippling outward through communities, corporations, and regulatory agencies that had learned the most important lesson of all. Environmental protection wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the smart thing to do, and the profitable thing to do, and ultimately the only sustainable foundation for human prosperity. In the end, a man with a mop had taught some of the most powerful people in America that true leadership meant listening to the voices that others chose to ignore, especially when those voices carried inconvenient truths about the real costs of business as usual. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.